If you don't know us, I'm Erica, and Lisa will be coming up shortly. And I'll give you full disclosure, these beautiful slides are all Lisa. I got to tag along for the ride, so if you like the design, talk to her. When you see mine, you're like, those are okay, but those are not Lisa slides. So we've worked together on a lot of fostering, and you might hear us talk later on about some other fostering research that we've done. In this session, we're going to talk about our emergency fostering that we did during COVID-19. All right, this works. All right, so I know we're all shelter folks here, but we'll just give you a little rundown on dogs and animal shelters. Each year, about over 3 million dogs enter U.S. shelters each year, so that's still quite a high number, although that number has thankfully come down. And we're doing a much better job at getting these dogs adopted and returned to owner, so great news for us. But a small proportion are still euthanized, sometimes for space in certain shelters, for medical or behavioral reasons as well. So it means that there's still room for improvement and areas that we can try and push the envelope and see what we can do for these dogs, especially while they're in our care and making good matches after they're with us in their adoptive home. So let's take a look briefly at life for dogs living in shelters. You probably experience similar stressors to what they do, right? You walk in there and it's quite loud. That's probably one of the biggest complaints across all shelters. I suspect the dogs might complain about that too. In fact, that we know that they get hearing damage if they're exposed long-term to the sound in a shelter. So these shelters are likely quite stressful compared to what your dogs at home are experiencing. And in fact, there's data to support that. We can look at cortisol levels, which is a measure of stress for dogs, and shelter dogs have elevated levels compared to owned dogs. And when owned dogs were put into a boarding facility for the first time, which they don't know that it's boarding, it probably feels like they're going into a shelter, it's no different, their cortisol levels tripled. So we know that they're stressful, and like I said, there are a number of stressors there. Certainly the sound is one, and not only is there just sound, but it probably disrupts their sleep and rest cycles as well. They're usually kenneled in relatively small kennels, which is going to limit their species typical behaviors and their ability to move around. There are usually limitations on social interactions. They might be co-housed, but oftentimes they're not. And they're usually limited in how much human social interaction that they can have. And of course, there's a loss of control, especially for kennels where they're entirely inside. The dog can't even modulate whether they're inside or outside or behind, a wall away from the potential adopters or not. And there's a loss of predictability. While they get, kind of regular food each day, they never know when somebody's going to come down the aisle, when a new dog might walk down the aisle or get put in the kennel with them, when they're going to get pulled out for veterinary care. And so that lack of routine is likely also a stressor. So given that, we're really interested in improving shelter dog welfare. That's why you'll see Lisa and me talk a lot about fostering, because that's one way that we found that we can really improve the lives of shelter dogs. And this has a lot of research behind it, not just ours from fostering, but across the board. Human interaction is the most studied and the most consistently effective intervention to improve shelter dog welfare, which is great news for us, right? Because it's cheap, it doesn't require any special equipment other than getting volunteers or staff or the public in to work with our dogs. And like I said, we do a lot of fostering research, and of course that really emphasizes human social interaction, because they're not just getting visited for half an hour or taken out for 20 minutes, they're going to somebody's home overnight, 2 nights, or potentially much longer than that. So this is one way then to really give them that interaction long term, which is likely beneficial. And of course, getting out of the shelter is going to remove those environmental stressors for them as well. In fact, in other studies that we'll talk about, we will talk about some of our research looking at sleepovers of 1 night or 2 nights and the beneficial effects that those had for dogs, reducing their cortisol while they're out on the sleepover. And another study looked at sleepovers of 3 nights and found the same results. So that kind of frames our talk, that we're really interested in fostering and see the benefits of fostering for shelter dogs. We were, in fact, in the middle of collecting more data on some of these sleepover questions that we had when COVID hit. And a lot of our research was travel-based. We're going out to shelters, and so COVID interrupted our research, much like it likely interrupted your lives and our lives as well. And so our fearless leader, Lisa, had this brilliant idea of quickly toggling. We already had the team set up that was working really well together. We had our data collection tools, our spreadsheets. We knew how to work with shelters. We'd been working with them remotely already. We would go out in person, but we were doing a lot of remote data collection already. So we thought, we have the processes already in place. Why don't we quickly tack to the right and study what goes on during an emergency event? And this is, of course, we've had emergencies before, like Hurricane Katrina or earthquakes. Those are usually localized, right, to one region that's experiencing that. It usually might disrupt the shelters in that area, but it doesn't disrupt shelters everywhere. So those shelters can transfer out dogs. This was, of course, a really different emergency where it affected the entire nation, and it affected the shelter's ability to function as normal. So on March 10th, 2020, that fateful day, WHO declared the coronavirus outbreak as a worldwide pandemic. And in March and April, over 90% of United States localities had stay-at-home orders in place to try and reduce disease spread. So that meant that we had an unprecedented number of people that were staying at home. Usually they're going to work or they're traveling, and those daily routines had been interrupted and they were staying at home, which maybe let them feel like they had more bandwidth to bring in a furry friend, either permanently or at least temporarily. And in fact, you can look through the headlines from back then that media outlets were reporting that U.S. animal shelters were getting an unprecedented number of requests about adopting or fostering animals. So NPR had one, the nation's dog supply chain has broken during the pandemic. Dog adoptions and sales soared during the pandemic. Everybody's picking up a pandemic animal. So many pets have been adopted during the pandemic that shelters are running out. We wish that would happen every day. The pandemic leads to surge in animal adoptions and fostering. And of course, not only was this a shift for the people adopting, right, that they were home, they felt like they had the bandwidth to do this, or fostering, but this was really kind of instigated on the shelter side as well. They were being told that they had to work on skeleton crews to reduce disease spread. They needed to really reduce capacity. So they're being encouraged to not take in more animals, to send the animals they did have out to adoption or fostering. And so that's where we came in. We studied what they did with their fostering animals. So in this study, we looked at how they utilized fosters during the pandemic when they're trying to push out large numbers of animals in a short amount of time, and they couldn't just transfer them to another shelter. So we worked with 19 different US shelters, and we'll go over some demographics of them in a moment, during the first 4 months of COVID-19, especially when those stay-at-home orders were in place and as they were being slightly lifted at some point. We also examined qualities of the shelters that we were working with to look at their processes for sending animals through their shelter, their capacity, their annual budget, things like that, and looked at how that correlated with how they utilized fosters during this time. And this, I think, gives us some really interesting information about how fosters might behave. Of course, this is during the pandemic, but I think this is a really useful study to look at what are the fosters doing, where are they coming from, who are they, do they come back for more, and whether they're adopting their dogs or not. So the research we're going to talk about has been published in Frontiers in Veterinary Science. It's an open source journal, so those are open access to you, so you can go on and find the PDF and download it for free if you'd like to, and you can dig in even more than what we'll have time to go through here. So as I mentioned, we recruited 19 US animal shelters that were engaging in fostering during this time and agreed to work with us. So those are some of our major requirements, right, that they wanted to play, and they were sending dogs to foster. We looked at this from March through June 2020, and we'll first go over kind of something about the dogs that were sent out. So during this time, these shelters sent out 1,155 dogs. So these were animals that were 8 weeks of age or older, 323 underage puppies, so under 8 weeks of age, and 747 dogs that were fostered to adopt. So they had been indicated ahead of time that the person was interested in adopting. We'll talk separately about what happened to the dogs that were not fostered with the idea of adoption, and did they get adopted or not. So during this time, 2,225 dogs in those 19 shelters went out to foster. Of course, some of these dogs were fostered multiple times. They might have gone out to a foster, the foster couldn't keep them any longer, or there was a limited time and they came back, maybe went out to another foster, or they weren't a fit in that first foster home and got transferred to another foster home. So when you look at the actual number of foster experiences, not just dogs, but actual experiences, so the dog could have multiple foster experiences, we had 1,331 dog foster experiences, 371 puppy fostering experiences, and 869 foster to adopt experiences, giving us a total of 2,571 foster experiences that we were tracking. These were the shelters that we looked at. You can see they range all over the United States. A couple of things that we'll point out. There it is. We categorize them by different types of shelters. So P&P, these are the private nonprofit group or shelters. We also have municipal shelters and private nonprofit shelters with government contracts, meaning they're doing some animal control. So you can see the majority, almost 90% of our shelters were private nonprofits, and about a third of those had government contracts. And then we just had a handful, about 4 municipal shelters. We also categorized them by admission type. So whether they had open admission, meaning they took any animal at any time, whether they had limited, and that was common for our private nonprofits. So they were selecting dogs or cats that they were bringing in. They weren't bringing in all of them. And we had some that were managed, meaning that they were controlling the flow of animals into their shelter. Because 2020 was such an odd year, we looked at their 2019 canine demographics to look at their canine intake. And again, you can see a wide range of shelters that we're working with. Some had upwards of 6,000 dogs coming into the year, and Pinellas here just had 121. So we had quite a range of shelters that we were looking at in terms of intake. We can also see, there we go. The number of dogs fostered during this time ranged from 15 or 13 up to 400 dogs being sent out. And Lisa will talk a little bit more about how the number of animals going out and how they utilize their fosters compares to some of these shelter demographics. So I won't go into that here, but just note that we did see a wide variety of numbers of dogs being fostered and also annual intake, how big that shelter typically was. And again, not only do we have the dogs fostered, but how many foster experiences they had if the dogs were going out to multiple foster homes. So the average 2019 live release rate for these shelters was on average, like I said, almost 94%, so it was great. But we did have, again, a range. It ranged from 67 to nearly 100%. So there was a range of live release rate in these shelters that added to kind of the demographic ranges that we see there. Nearly all of them, almost 98% of them, had some sort of fostering program already in place, although there's been recent research suggesting that our numbers are probably pretty high, right? And we kind of looked for shelters that were engaging in fostering during the pandemic. If they were doing that, they probably already had a fostering program up and running that they could leverage for this. So, this is high, I think, from some other research that polled shelters a few years ago. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the shelter processes. We asked them about their behavioral assessments because we thought, well, this is a great time to find out what are shelters doing. Not only are we interested in what you're doing with your fostering, but we're interested in what you're doing in the shelter as well, and how are you making matches for these foster dogs. So slightly over half of the shelters were conducting routine behavioral assessments. That means almost 58% of them were not conducting routine behavioral assessments, and I think Lisa is talking tomorrow about behavioral assessments. So if you have questions about that, you can come to Lisa's talk. We also asked them about whether they're collecting dog-dog information. How did this dog respond to other dogs, especially since they're going into a home. We've been really interested in how do we make matches, both short-term for fostering, but long-term for adoptions, if the dog is going into a home that already has a resident dog. Nearly 60% of the shelters we worked with reported they were already gathering information on dogs' abilities to interact with other dogs. They did that through a number of methods. 26% of them did one-on-one, so they pull out, another shelter dog and do some one-on-one interactions. Some only did groups, likely play groups, and some had a combination of both one-on-one and group interactions, about 26%. And one of what we think is a major deficit in sheltering, 58% did not have behavior personnel on staff. So certainly, in terms of areas for sheltering to grow in, making behavior personnel routine at all shelters would certainly be a great step. When we looked at how they matched dogs for adoptions, nearly 90% of shelters did not require all family members to meet the dog prior to adoption, and only 21% of shelters required meetings between any resident dog and shelter dog, which we think is really interesting. When we've run fostering programs, we pretty much required that they bring a resident dog in, and found that has increased our success of matching. So I think that's something really interesting to look at and see how that plays out in terms of returns and successful adoptions. In fact, over 3/4 of the shelters had no meeting requirements whatsoever prior to adoption. So again, when we're thinking about making good matches, I think these are some of the questions we ought to be looking at and seeing how does this impact success in fostering or success in adoptions. So we'll take a look at who the dogs were in our study. And you can see that nearly 39% of them were transfers from another organization. So that big blue is transfer. 30% was stray. 20% were owner surrender. 7% were returns, and 4% were cruelty cases. So we, again, get kind of a range of sources of intake for the dogs in our study. When we looked at the sex of the dogs going out on fostering events, they were roughly split between males and females, and their average age was 38 months, so just a little bit over 3 years of age. Their average weight was 38 pounds. Of course, we get some variation there, but that was our mean. When you look at the length of stay, because I think, certainly the pandemic's strange, but one of the concerns always is if you're sending a dog to foster, are you increasing its length of stay? How is that impacting things? So when you look at length of stay, they spent an average of 43 days in the shelter's care. Slightly less than half of that time was spent in a foster home, so about 20 days. So these fosters were keeping the dogs for almost 3 weeks. And again, when we're thinking about making decisions on how we run our foster programs, asking the adopters or the fosters what's their ideal time, I think is a really great way to go. And we've asked that in some of our research. Rather than just saying, great, you're going to foster this dog and we'll see you sometime. So maybe giving them an end date or figuring out exactly what works for them. What are they looking for? And I think from some of our research, a couple weeks in there is sort of what we see as their ideal time, which might not be the ideal time for the shelter, right? You might want much longer than that. So we also asked about dogs that they sent out that had known behavioral needs, so that the shelter knew ahead of time that they had some behavioral challenges that they were trying to match and they're trying to manage while they're in the foster home. About 20% of foster experiences were with dogs that had those continuing behavioral needs. In all of those foster events, there were only 15 bites reported, which was fantastic. That's about 1% of foster experiences had a bite incident. And those bites were sort of evenly distributed between being a bite to a human or a bite to a dog. Bite to the dog was 7 bites. To humans, we had 8 bites. And interestingly, bites happened more often with dogs that had not been priorly identified as having a behavioral challenge. So these were the dogs that they hadn't identified ahead of time that had a behavioral challenge. So I think about twice as many of those bites, 2/3 of them were from dogs that did not have identified behavioral needs prior to going into foster. So I am going to turn it over.
Are there any questions?
Gunter. Yeah, while we switch.
We love questions. Don't be shy.
All right, so Erica sort of chatted about the first part of our work, which is a lot about describing the dogs. And I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit, and we're going to talk about the foster caregivers. And so we had a lot of questions regarding who is actually fostering these dogs? Because I think we had questions regarding, kind of sort of two things. We were interested in their relationship to the shelter, because do you remember those news articles we mentioned before? There were so many people reaching out to the shelter wanting to foster or even adopt. And so that led us to kind of categorizing the caregivers in two different ways. Those that were newly recruited members of the community, meaning that they had not provided caregiving before, or in our second part here, they had some sort of prior relationship to the shelter. Now that might mean that they're a staff member, they had previously fostered for the shelter, or they were a volunteer. And I know in some organizations, volunteer is everything, but in this case, we are separating out those that are caregivers that never stepped foot in the shelter before, and volunteers, which are those that have stepped foot in the shelter, but they haven't dipped their toe into foster caregiving. Does that make sense to everyone? So we've got those two categories? Cool. So we found that nearly 43% of foster caregivers in our study were fostering for the first time with that animal shelter. So that really does track when we think about those news reports that, in fact, a lot of people were coming out for the first time. We had a third that had previously fostered for the organization. Am I being told that I'm not doing it? Yeah, okay, how about I just take it off? I don't have to be fashionable. Fine, whatever. Yeah, no problem. We had, like I said, over a third that had previously fostered. And then we had 13% of caregivers that had started fostering during the pandemic. So think of that, newly recruited members of the community, and then they came back and did it again. And we're pretty interested in those folks as well. We had 5% that were volunteers at the shelter. So remember, they were probably dog walkers, something like that, and now they were trying fostering for the first time. Any questions about that? Okay. So we'll give you a bit more on the demographics of the caregivers. We found that caregivers on average were about 36 years old. And when we looked at, and we'll dig into this a little bit more about the makeup of their homes with regards to resident dogs, but puppy foster caregivers were more likely to have dogs in their home than dog foster caregivers. So those are caregivers of dogs that are 8 weeks and older. Right, which is not surprising when we think about puppy caregiving. Maybe they're in a room, they're separated, making a mess that is awful, but secluded away. And you can have another dog or two in the house, and they may not even interact with the puppies, or may do it quite infrequently. And if a foster giver of either type had a dog in their home, nearly half only had one dog. And so we can take a look at this table here. I think it's really interesting to really kind of dig into what are the qualities of these homes. And so we can see on the left-hand side here, we see the caregiver's relationship to the shelter. Bold are our two categories. So we have no prior relationship, which are those new community members. And then we have those folks that have a prior relationship. Either you're a shelter volunteer, a returning community member. So that's somebody that's going back for another time. We have a returning foster caregiver. So that's someone that has done foster caregiving for the shelter before staff. And then we kind of have this oddball situation of the finder owners, like what the heck are they? And we don't really know if they've had a relationship to the shelters. And what's kind of something that's like pretty striking when we take a look at the number of resident dogs on the top and the number of dogs across. What do you guys see pretty quickly? Take a look at this here compared to those dogs across. What do we see?
People that have a dog.
Yeah.
During fostering.
Yeah. So this is pretty interesting, right? When we think about the capacity of individuals in our community that are thinking about fostering, we see overwhelmingly in our data that most of the time folks do not have a dog in their home, particularly when we take a look at those new community members. The majority of them, nearly 3/4, were not having a dog. So I think that this is sort of a really interesting opportunity to take a look at why did the foster caregiving end. I think that there's some things that we can all, kind of think about with regards to how this might inform adoption as well. Although this is just foster care, we can kind of think about why things don't work out for people. And so on the left-hand side here, you'll see the reason why foster care ended. We have adoption, so the dog was brought back to the shelter because they were being adopted. The dog had some sort of behavioral or medical concern. And when we think about the behavior one, I'll just point this out because we went round and round on this. We wanted, we went into it thinking, wow, we want behavior to be about the dog, the fostered dog, being placed, and that dog had some sort of behavioral problem, right? That's what, right? But we quickly realized that it's very hard to know who is the naughty dog, right? If we don't know how the resident dog and the foster dog interact in a way that we can understand that. So when we talk about behavior, that is any sort of behavioral issue with the dog, but it could also be the resident dog having issues with the foster dog as well. Does that make sense to everyone? We tried. We were so interested in that question. We have caregiver related. So that's the caregiver, their life not being hospitable to fostering anymore. Perhaps they're traveling, perhaps they've had a change in schedule. And then we also separated this out, a scheduled return by the shelter. So this typically, as you can see, plays a role in puppy foster caregiving because the puppies reach age and they then go up for adoption. So one of the things that we were pretty surprised, interested, want to dig into this much more, is that we found that there was a difference between dogs being returned for behavioral issues. So as we mentioned before, we separated out dogs that the shelter had said, you have some sort of behavioral issue going into foster care. We also did the same thing for medical as well. And we did find a relationship. We're not going to talk about it because it's a pretty, I don't think we will, this will be probably meaningful in real life. We did find that also dogs that had some sort of medical issue being placed into foster care were more often returned for medical issues than dogs that didn't. But the practical significance is quite tiny. Whereas this, I think, is something that we really want to focus on. And so when dogs that had some sort of behavioral issue were placed in foster care, they more often, over 3 times more often, were returned for behavioral issues than dogs that went out to foster care without any known behavioral challenges. Any questions about that? I see faces like, Yeah, Margaret?
I was just wondering, and maybe you're going to get to this, I mean, is that because they were labeled as having behavior issues because those are really egregious issues? And therefore you expect it, or is it simply because they were labeled as behavior and so people were more likely to be looking for a problem?
Yeah, no, I think I don't know if we can tease that apart. I think it's a bit Oh, so I broke the rules already. So Margaret was wondering kind of what's the directionality here, right? That is there some sort of impact or bias because these dogs are labeled as having some sort of behavioral issue. Is that the gist of it, Margaret? Yeah. And so, and I agree. It's hard to know how that sort of impression clouds like how they interact with the dog. I will say though that we. There's pros and cons to this because our team kind of talked about, should we have some really strict criteria about what is a behavioral challenge? But at the end of the day, we left it to the shelter. And we said, do you perceive this as some sort of challenge? And so we do have a wide range there as well, which I think in some ways that variability, you would imagine that perhaps things that are of not as risky or problematic being less likely to be returned from some shelters, and then those that are placing really difficult dogs. And so the fact that we still find a relationship, I think, is worth exploring more. And we'll dig into what does this mean for us in this kind of post-pandemic world. All right, so the entire aim of the study, we talk about so much stuff, but what we were really interested in is how are shelters using foster care during the pandemic? Think about, again, those media reports. This is how we answer this question. And so, as kind of Erica discussed, we had shelters of wide range, right? You saw how many dogs they would bring in, you saw how many foster experiences. So how do you possibly kind of compare these differences across shelters? Well, we came up with our very clever acronym, our foster utilization ratio. And so, it's okay, you guys don't have to laugh. It provided a lot of entertainment for us. So the foster utilization ratio is pretty simple. We took a look at the number of dogs in foster care, and that's a ratio over the number of dogs in foster and shelter care. So total care. So foster over total care. This was an incredible amount of work to go through all of the reports from all the 19 different shelters, and we calculated this on a daily level. So every single day we took a look at how many dogs are in foster care, which we knew because we were keeping track of that on our spreadsheets, but then we had to go through all the dogs that were in the care of the shelter, and looking at that on a daily level. And we started that, as Erica said, when the pandemic began, and we did it through June. And so this data I'm going to show you on the graph is the average utilization of foster care on a monthly level across the shelters based on their daily utilization ratio. So does that make sense? So every day we're saying how many dogs are in foster care. We then average that on a monthly level, and then we're looking at change over 4 months. And what we find here is that we find a significant increase in the utilization of foster care from March through to April 2020. And again, this tracks, right? That we see that there's a significant increase compared to the start of the pandemic. But there's the flip side, and that we see that in fact that high in April, we quickly find that it starts to decrease in May, and that by June, most of the utilization of foster care had returned to levels similar to the start of the pandemic. What's a bit more interesting is that we took a look at how the type of organization, whether it was municipal, private nonprofit, or private nonprofit with contracts, how that may have influenced shelters' foster utilization ratio. And what we find is that municipal shelters more quickly return to those initial pandemic levels. Take a look at them, they're in the red. So at the top, sorry, I should have explained this. We have overall private nonprofit in blue, private nonprofit in contracts in green, and then red is municipal. On the bottom, again, we have the months. On the right, on the y-axis, we have the utilization ratio. And we see, compared to private nonprofit with contracts, we are seeing that the increase for municipal shelters was huge. It was like 240%. So wowzers, like way big increase in foster caregiving, but it pretty quickly dropped for them versus some of the private nonprofit and private nonprofit with contracts were able to sustain their levels a little bit longer before returning to virtually sort of regular levels. Yeah.
I have a question. Did you compare that at all to what their population was at the time? Because like I know with us, we saw a huge dive as far as how many animals in care we had. Does that have any correlation to how many were out in foster?
Sure. That's a really great question. So this is a ratio. So we're taking, it's not a number, so it's a discrete value, but instead it's a ratio of all the dogs in foster care, dogs in the shelter. I did it again. So the question, the summarizing of the question, I feel like it's like a good task for me. So essentially what your question was about is, does this account for the dogs that were in the shelter, like the population itself? And so the ratio, if we go back to it, right, it's the number of dogs in foster care over total dogs in the care of the shelter, right? Shelter, foster, right? And so with that being said, absolutely, once you start having less animals come through, you might have changes in that ratio that are not about foster caregiving. And I think that is a good point to mention, that ratio, you might have some real highs there that you can't really sustain, especially if you reduce the flow coming in. Okay. So what were then the outcomes of these dogs and puppies that we were following in our study? Well, we had over 93% that had positive outcomes, and we considered a positive outcome being adoption, a transfer, or a return to owner. We had about 5% of dogs remained in care, and mostly those were in foster. Over 4% of the dogs were in foster care. And then we had about a little less than 2% that had some sort of negative outcome. They were lost or died in care. They were euthanized for behavior or euthanized for medical reasons. But again, a pretty small proportion. Erica was mentioning these dogs before, these dogs that we call lovingly foster to adopt, dogs that were placed in foster care with an owner that was interested in adopting. What we found here, which I think is pretty exciting, is that nearly 73% of these dogs that were placed in a foster to adopt situation were adopted by their foster caregiver, which is pretty exciting. Conversely, we do not see the same sort of conversion rate, if you want, if you could say, with our other types of fostering. Only 7% of fosters of underage puppies adopted their dogs, and only 18%, which is still a good number, mind you, but 18% of dogs that were fostered, so those are dogs that are 8 weeks and older, were adopted by their caregivers. Yeah?
Was for the puppies, was that any research done on, was that because litters of puppies went out and not sold?
That's such a great question. So it's like you guys read our minds. We are always like digging into like, what do these mean? And so, we make some recommendations. Oh, sorry, thank you. So the question was, did the puppies go out single in litters? And we were anticipating that they were going to go out in litters, but that's actually not what we found. We found that many puppies were going out solo. And so we make some recommendations in the paper about how to treat those puppies that are going out in foster care. Essentially, our sort of recommendation on the sort of puppy side, which may be slightly controversial, I don't know, but placing those puppies directly with adopters versus spending time in foster care, especially if they're going out as singles versus, and again, this is a recommendation when they were single, not when they were a puppy, in litters, but if we're already sending them out as singles, why not place them in an adoptive home and save that foster home for another dog? Please don't shoot me. Okay, so we want to take a look as well at the relationship between foster caregiving and the likelihood of adoption. Essentially, foster failure, right? We want to know the frequency of that. And what we found is that those new foster caregivers, folks that had never fostered for the shelter before, were over 4 times more likely to adopt their dog. About 29, so the percentages work out to about 29% of fosters adopted, and only about, again, this is an average of those other types, all types of foster caregiving, about 7% of those with a prior relationship adopted. We also found that over 77% of dogs that were adopted by their new foster caregiver had no other dogs in their home. So this is like starting, I hope, starting to form in your mind. How can I take these findings and apply them to our adoption programs, to our foster programs? Because again, these aren't 100%, but we can start thinking about probabilities and what people are likely going to do when they're in a foster to adopt situation or foster caregiving. Lastly, we took a look at the impact of resources. And this is an incredibly rough and ready number. So again, this does not have the specificity that we would like, but we wanted to take a look at how the available resources of a shelter impacted their choices. And so we calculated the shelter's resources, again, like I said, very rough and ready number, but we took a look at their annual operating budget and then then divided that by the number of animals that were taken into the shelter the previous year. And from that, we were able to categorize them into 5 different resource groups, and we had some pretty clear breaks in the ranges when we did this calculation for each of the 19 shelters. And you can see that these sort of resource levels on the right-hand side are based on how much they had to spend per animal. Now we know, right, that not all of your operating budget is going to animals, that there are salaries, there are other programs that are external that have nothing to do with the care of the animals. Yeah, get it. But this is kind of, again, just a sort of rough and ready way to say, do resources make a difference? And you can see that we had shelters that had a very low amount of money they were able to spend per animal versus we had shelters that had quite a bit of money to spend for the animals in their care. And so what do we see then with that sort of relationship between shelter resources and foster caregiving? Well, we found that very low resource shelters relied more heavily on individuals that had a prior relationship to their shelter. In fact, nearly 79% of all foster experiences with shelters that were very low resourced had foster caregivers with a prior relationship to the shelter. Conversely, very high resource shelters recruited more community members. So those are new foster caregivers. And so again, this is a pretty interesting kind of way to take a look at how did the resources that we have influence the type of foster caregivers that we're recruiting or relying on to provide foster caregiving for the animals in our care. And lastly, we can take a look at how shelter resources affected the outcomes of the dogs. So again, that last slide was about the foster caregivers that they were utilizing, but now we're going to take a look at, well, how do shelter resources then interact with that dog outcome? And what we found, in fact, that yes, the outcomes of the dogs did differ based on the resources available to the shelter. And specifically, we found that very low resource shelters transferred more dogs out of their facilities, while shelters that were more resourced rehomed dogs directly to owners at a rate of above 80%. Very low resource shelters had about a 43% adoption rate with a 49, almost 50% rate of transfer out. So they were getting there. The very low resource shelters were getting there. You can see this graph, but they were just doing it in a different way. And so on the left-hand side, we have our resource levels from very low to very high, and then our color coding for outcome. Was the dog adopted, transferred, returned to the owner, remaining in care, lost or died in care, and then we have yellow for euthanasia that was behavior-related and euthanasia that was medical-related. And I think you can easily see right here this very big difference for our very low resource shelters. But with the exception of maybe the low shelters, what we're seeing is that ultimately they are getting to about the same amount of positive outcomes. Like I said, just doing it in a slightly different way, utilizing those transfer out programs to get the dogs to another facility that then they can directly adopt out. Any questions about that? Yeah. I love that I will repeat this question, I promise. I'm learning.
Did you delve into, as far as like the transfers, like most of the shelters in the Northeast were receivers?
Yeah.
Did you do anything with the demographics of that?
No, we didn't. I know that could be like a whole other paper about the sort of flow of animals from different localities, but we weren't able, or it wasn't within the scope of the study to take a look at the shelters that were, transferring, where were they transferring to? Super interesting question, because right at the end of the day, we have a supply issue or a supply chain issue with dogs. So, any other questions? No? Okay. So what you've all come for then, because hopefully we're kind of slowly maybe coming out of the pandemic, who knows? I don't know at this point. But we want you to be able to take this presentation and use it to your advantage at your shelter. So what are our takeaways then for our post-pandemic world? First one is just the biggest one. Treat your first-time foster caregivers like trial adopters. Because we saw how the higher proportion of adoption from these caregivers compared to caregivers that had a prior relationship to the shelter. And if they don't have a dog in the home, it's even more likely. So, and it's sort of interesting when we think about first-time foster caregivers, and we separate in our minds that these folks are different than our trial adopters. But are they? In our mind, we've categorized them as different, but perhaps for the people that are deciding that they want to foster caregive, and again, we didn't measure this, so we don't know, but they are also thinking that, hey, we're going to try this out and see if we like it. Well, why not have the same process? And I think why we bring this up as being so important is think about all those resources you put in training your foster caregivers that first time, right? And how much resources and how much you could more quickly get them into your into the stream of things. If you said, hey, you know what? It's your first time foster caregiving. Why don't you talk to our trial adoption or foster to adopt program? And if you want to foster any dog in the shelter, feel free, any of those dogs. And those are likely going to be dogs on the adoption floor. But why not? And if the dog gets placed and it's not their house, great. Then get them more into your training programs for foster caregivers. But they might be trialing it out. And I think that it's not the best use of resources if they're more likely than not going to fail. And if you don't have a trial adoption program, man, you've got to start one, right? The conversion rate is fantastic, and and if you kind of don't believe those numbers, then take a look at our other research, come to our other talk. But when we look at stays of 1, 2, and we'll be talking about our week-long fostering, dogs going into homes for even a short amount of time is an improvement to their welfare. So we can look at it as both helping them get adopted as well as them having a better quality of life while living out of the shelter. Our third one is that you've got to be providing extra support to dogs that have behavioral challenges. We can't just place them in a home and say that's enough, that now you're out of the stress of the shelter, so easy breezy. We've got to have more support for them. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that, as Erica said before, the dogs don't know that they're going into a foster home. So it's really, in terms of behavior, likely no different than being placed in an adoptive home. And so we've got to provide extra support to not only our foster caregivers that are fostering dogs with behavioral challenges, but we've also got to be providing those same resources to adopters that are taking on these dogs that have some sort of behavioral issue. And lastly, and we didn't talk very much about this, again, this is in the paper, but I think a really sort of easy sort of takeaway here is that when we took a look at the different types of programs that the shelter, or sort of practices the shelter was doing during the pandemic, one of the things, or a couple of the things we looked at was, did the shelter allow the caregivers to do meet and greets of the dogs at their home or nearby, but something that was kind of orchestrated by the caregiver, as well as did the shelter allow the dogs to be adopted directly from the foster home instead of coming back to the shelter. And we found that when shelters had these two types of practices in place, allowing caregivers to handle meet and greets and adopt directly from the home, these dogs had shorter lengths of stay than dogs that had to go back to the shelter to be, shown to go back to the shelter to coordinate the adoption. And so again, that was so correlational. We have a ton of caveats in the paper, so I'm not like, oh my God, this is the next best thing. And we also know, I put this in there if they want to, because not all foster caregivers are interested in being, their adoption liaison. And that's okay. We have to check in with our foster caregivers and understand, are you interested in the caregiving part and you're interested in placement, or you just want to do the caregiving? But I think that that's an important distinction that we found in our work is important for some people. And I think this comes a lot from our own team and having differing opinions about it. But I think that our evidence here suggests that these could be pretty easy practices to implement for the folks that want to do it and could make a difference in how long the dog is in the care of the shelter. So with that, I'm going to close. Hopefully I'm doing okay on time. But we're really excited about this work. It represents really, outside of just the pandemic, the most detailed reporting about fostering in U.S. animal shelters to date. And we're really excited to kind of add to the literature about foster caregiving because I think this work, helps us move beyond our own personal experiences, our organization's experiences, and let us have more evidence-based best practices around foster caregiving. And hopefully these sort of takeaways we've described about foster recruitment, trial adoption programs, caregiving practices, and behavioral support can be utilized by you all so that you can improve your foster caregiving programs in a post-pandemic world. So with that, I want to thank our shelter partners. We absolutely could not do this work without them, and we're so glad that they allow us to bother them for months and months and collect data and use our silly spreadsheets and keep on talking to us. That's like pretty great. This work was a Herculean effort by everyone that you see on this screen, as well as folks that, and Erica, and folks that, just played a key role in helping us collect this data and be able to analyze that. And of course, I want to thank our funder, Maddie's Fund. And here are our email addresses if you guys want to hit us up with any questions. Thank you.